Hello, today we're going to be looking at some of the Egyptian religious literature. We're going to start in Volume A, page 25, The Great Hymn to the Aten. And the first thing I want to think about is what is a hymn? Well, it's a kind of song, but not every song is a hymn, right? A hymn is a song of praise, usually to a god or goddess, in this case to Aten. So then the next question is who or what is Aten. And rather than just take your translator's, uh, your author's word for it, let's look at the actual text of the hymn. Um, Aten rises in heaven's light land, and that translates the word Achet, which is usually translated as horizon. So it rises on the eastern horizon, Aten does, fills every land with his beauty. His rays embrace the lands, and when he sets on the western horizon, it gets dark. You know what? That sure does sound like the sun, doesn't it? The sun was always um, really the most important of the Egyptian gods. And particularly in the reign of this particular pharaoh, Akhenaten, um, who tried to reform the traditional Egyptian religion into the worship of a single god, Aten. Um, that reform, by the way, was not terribly popular, and his son Tutankhamun took Egyptian religion back to its traditional polytheistic form, as in fact expressed in his name, Amun, another name for the sun god. Um, Even in this hymn, Aten is equated with Re, line 9. Being Re, you reach their limits, okay? Egypt was not originally a unified society. It began as a series of villages along the Nile River. And they they all worshipped the same gods. Ancient gods tend to be personifications of natural forces like the sun, the moon, the storm, the river, the ocean, um, things of that sort. Each city had its own stories about the gods and its own names for them. When Egypt coalesced into two kingdoms, Upper and Lower Egypt, and confusingly for us, Upper Egypt is in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, um, which confuses us because we conventionally put north at the top of our maps. Um, but upper and lower refers to upstream and downstream. The Nile flows north, it rises, it begins in East Africa, um, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda region, and flows north through Sudan and Egypt and empties into the Mediterranean Sea on its in its southeastern corner. And so upriver is south, downriver is north, and so upper Egypt, upriver, southern Egypt, lower Egypt, the Nile Delta in the north. And eventually those were consolidated into a single kingdom. But the pharaoh, always wore a crown that had emblems of both kingdoms on it. He was the king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Um, Anyway, what is he praised for doing? Well, in the first stanza, lines 1 to about 13, um, he's praised for his greatness, his beauty. And then if we skip to page 26, as you dispel the dark, as you cast your rays, the two lands are in festivity. Awake, they stand on their feet. You've roused them, bodies cleansed, clothed. Their arms adore your appearance. He gives order. All the beasts browse on their herbs. Trees, herbs are sprouting. Birds fly from their nests. Okay. All that fly up in a light, they live when you dawn for them. He gives order, makes things happen as they're supposed to happen. Line about 45, who makes seed grow in women, who creates people from sperm, who feeds the son in his mother's womb. So Aten gives life. How long could we survive without sunlight? Well, the answer is not very long, because all of the plants that we eat depend on the sun to grow. If it were dark 24/7, they wouldn't survive. And the animals that we eat eat plants, so they couldn't survive long without the plants, and the plants couldn't survive long without sunlight. So you get the picture. But I want to go back to that second stanza, beginning about line 13. When you set in western lightland, earth is in darkness. Well, duh. But he doesn't stop there. He says, as if in death. Do we have to associate darkness with death? One sleeps in chambers, heads covered. Okay, and the image that gives me is like a kid who's frightened and pulls the covers up over their head. One eye does not see another. Were they robbed of their goods that are put under their heads, people would not remark it. That one needs a little explaining. Unless you were literally the Pharaoh. In ancient Egypt, you lived in a house made of mud brick. Okay? Mud, perhaps put over thatch, dried in the sun, with a dirt floor. Okay? There were no banks. For that matter, there are no coins. There's no money as such. And so, whatever valuables you might have, the only place you have to keep it is in your house. Well, what would be the safest thing to do with it? Bury it in the floor of your house. Remember, the floor is made of dirt. Dig a hole, bury your stuff, hide it, and then you sleep on it. If you were a peasant, a poorer person, you slept probably using straw as a mattress on the floor. Wealthier people had beds, and if you look at the PowerPoint I give you on ancient Egypt, there's a reconstruction of an ancient Egyptian bed in there, and your valuables would be in the ground, in the floor underneath your bed. Now, may I submit to you that if somebody can dig through the baked clay wall of your house, and by the way, they could get away with making their houses out of mud brick, not fired in a kiln like we do our bricks, just dried in the sun, because it almost never rains in Egypt. Okay? Somebody can dig through the mud brick wall of your house and dig up your treasures literally right from under you without you noticing. May I submit that something is wrong? Every lion comes from its den, all the serpents bite. Darkness hovers, earth is silent. Okay, that sounds ominous, sounds threatening, sounds scary. Do we have to think that way about darkness? You know, all the music that I know is old now. I still listen to the music I listened to when I was your age. Then it was contemporary, now it's oldies. Oh well. But I remember an old Neil Diamond song. Thank the Lord for the nighttime, forget the day. You know, the idea was that daytime, um, I have to sell my time to make a living, right? My time belongs to somebody else. But at night, that's my time. That's when I can do what I want. Okay? That's a very different attitude from this. I want to submit to you that I think light and darkness in this hymn are more than just physical daylight and darkness. Yes, it gets daylight when the sun rises and it's dark when it sets. You know, people have known that for a lot longer than you can imagine. And yeah, I know as human beings, we don't see terribly well at night. But I think that darkness and daylight here are a metaphor for something else. In ancient Egyptian religion, the concept is called Ma'at. M-A-A-T. Ma'at is the order of things. When Ma'at is observed, and Ma'at involves what we would call religion, the right worship of the gods. It also involves what we would call politics, the right ordering of society. And it involves what we would call morality, the right way to live. When we are living right in all those areas, when Ma'at is being observed, everything fits together harmoniously and it works out good. When Ma'at is not observed, things fall apart. And it's kind of like the law of gravity. You know, if you climb to the top of a 10-story building and you want to protest the law of gravity, and so you get up on the roof and you step off into space, do the gravity police come and arrest you? No, the law of gravity enforces itself, right? You fall, and they don't send the police to arrest you. They send an ambulance crew to come clean up the mess and take you to the morgue. That's the way Ma'at works. See, Ma'at is the order of nature, the order of the world. And if it's followed, things turn out good. You know, you try to defy it, it's like trying to defy the law of gravity. It ain't going to work. bottom of page 26, makes reference to Aten making the earth as he wished, you alone. We'll say more about that in a little bit. It goes on to talk about how Aten made the world as it is. It talks about the annual flooding of the Nile, which is what the Egyptians depended on, not only to water their crops, their fields, but also to fertilize it, because it brought the Nile in the years before the Aswan Dam was built in the 1960s, carried rich silt from East Africa north and deposited it in Egypt. In fact, the Egyptian word for their land, Kemet, the black land, referred to that rich soil that was they used to grow crops. Egypt was, for hundreds and even thousands of years, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world because of this annual flooding of the Nile, and this rich silt that they grew their crops in, as opposed to the desert, the red land, the desert sand, which was useless. And in fact, that's where we get our word desert. And by the way, the calendar that we use, a solar-based calendar on the sun, how long it takes the Earth to make an orbit around the sun, or the apparent movement of the sun in our sky. Ancient people didn't know about the Earth revolving around the sun. Our calendar is descended from a calendar developed by the ancient Egyptians to be able to predict the flooding of the Nile. So Aten makes the world as it is, with its harmonies and its rhythms, including especially the flooding of the Nile, Hapi as it's called in Egyptian. He creates the order of the world. Okay? Ma'at is established at the first moment of creation, what the Egyptians called the first time. And it never changes. In that sense, Egyptian religion was extremely conservative. It never, ever changes. And the ending of the hymn to the Aten on page 28 talks about the role of the Pharaoh in maintaining Ma'at. See, for the Egyptians, the Pharaoh was not just a human being who got to be king. The Pharaoh was a divine presence with them. And therefore, they thought that their society was better than everybody else's. The Egyptians were not the last people in human history to have a superiority complex. Okay, the ancient Greeks had one, the Romans had one, Republicans have one. They may have been the first, at least the first that I know about. They viewed the presence of the Pharaoh among them as a blessing. And so they never developed a law code like you're going to read when we get to the Babylonians and the Code of Hammurabi, or some of the Hebrew laws from the Old Testament you're going to read. For the Egyptians, the law of the land was the mouth of the Pharaoh. Justice was not conformity to an outside law or to the Constitution, Justice was the presence of the Pharaoh living among them. And while there are coups like what the Trumpanzees attempted yesterday at the Capitol building in Washington, um, there's no attempt ever to overthrow the institution of the monarchy. There's nothing like a French Revolution. Um, the rule of the Pharaoh is viewed as um, God's blessing, and Egypt's rightful place is on top. And it is the Pharaoh's job not only to maintain the right worship of the gods and the right ordering of society within Egypt, but also um, Egypt's dominance over its neighbors. Now, I gave you an excerpt from this book, The Wisdom of Ancient Egypt. And I'd recommend this if you're interested in reading more about more Egyptian literature. This is a nice collection. Uh, and I gave you some of their creation stories. The Egyptians never developed a Bible, that is, an authoritative version of their religious stories. Rather, the stories are there, and there are multiple stories, and they do evolve over time. But there's never a fixed "this is the way it is" version. Um, Several of them, and I gave you a couple, um, begin with the sun god Re, who creates the world and all of the other gods. And in both of the ones I gave you, he creates the other gods, who are called the Aeneid, the group of the highest ranking gods. In a rather unusual way, it may seem to you. Um, in the first one, Re Atum Keprer, sun god and creator. Atum is he who indeed created by his masturbation. He placed his phallus in his fist and aroused desire therewith. Then were born the twins Shu and Tefnut. In the second one, the creation, according to Re, talks about I'm the one who came into being as Kepri, the creator. When I came into being, being itself came into being. There was nothing before Re. All beings came into being after I came into being. And how does that happen? Well, he says that I it was who aroused desire with my fist. I masturbated with my hand and I spat it from my own mouth. To create other living beings by masturbation may seem odd to us, but from an ancient perspective, it makes perfect sense. Remember, there is no science. Modern science is only about 500 years old. Okay? It's based on a common sense view of the world. Uh, and in our ordinary daily experience, where does life come from? Where did you come from? Okay. All ancient societies were agricultural societies. Everybody was familiar with farming and herding. Okay. Kids who grow up on a farm do not have to be taught the facts of life. They know them because they have seen the animals mating. Okay? In our everyday experience of life in the world, life comes from sex. Well, at this point in the creation, Ray is the only being who exists. And so the sexual act through which he creates other beings has to be solo. And our word for that is masturbation, right? So if you look at it from that angle, it makes perfect sense. He creates sexually the other gods, including the primordial waters. Human beings come from the tears. In fact, the word for tears um, is similar to the word for people. His glorious eye, the sun, cries, those tears become the first human beings. And in this first moment, as the earth rises as a hill out of the primordial waters, they called it the Bin Bin. At that first moment of creation, Ma'at is established. The true and right order of things is laid down, and it never, ever changes. Now, I gave you in a PDF called Egyptian Lit um, some of the ritual that went along with these creation stories. Um, in this, the first one on the page headed Egyptian creation myths. That creation story was recited every day in the big temples to the sun god, along with a ritual that was carried out in order to strengthen Re every morning and every evening. See, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, right? Well, when it sets in the west, where does it come back up the next morning? Back in the east. Well, how did it get over there? It didn't go across the sky. We'd have seen that, right? So it must have gone through the underworld, an underground passage. Well, the underworld is a dangerous place. Okay, it's dark and it's associated with death. The Egyptians, like us, buried their dead in the ground. Okay, and they knew that dangerous animals, especially snakes, live in holes in the ground, right? Well, every night as he makes his journey through the underworld, Ray is threatened by the chaos monster Apophe, who is depicted as a snake. And so, in reciting this creation story, the priest would draw a pulphe on a sheet of papyrus in green ink and put it inside a box on which the name of pulphe is written. Um, Perhaps a wooden box, perhaps um, something akin to paper mache. And he ties it up and he puts it on the fire. And when it's burned to ashes, he takes the ashes and he stomps on it with his left foot and he spits on it. And he says, Re is triumphant over thee, O Pophe, 4 times. And Horus, another name for the sun god, is triumphant over his enemy 4 times. And Pharaoh, life, prosperity, health to him, is triumphant over his enemies 4 times. In order to magically strengthen Re for this conflict with the Pophe that he has to take on every night. And to show the link between the Pharaoh and the gods, when you've written the names of every enemy of the Pharaoh, whether they're dead or alive, and put not only their names, but the names of their fathers and mothers and children inside a box, and you make these little tiny wax figurines of them and put them on the fire, you do the same thing. At the rising of the sun, and again when Re sets in the west, you do it in the morning to strengthen Re after this journey and this struggle, and you do it again in the evening. That's kind of like the post game meal if you're uh, on one of our athletic teams, and the pregame meal is in the evening as the sun is setting. You strengthen Re with this ritual. Now, to a modern scientific mind, this seems a little silly, maybe, to think that the sun might not rise tomorrow morning if this was not done. But let me point out to you that in over 2,000 years of recorded ancient Egyptian history, when this ritual was carried out, never once did the sun fail to rise. It worked. It worked. Okay. Last thing I want to mention to you is the admonitions of Ipuwer, which also deals with this idea of Ma'at. And it is probably um, originally reflecting conditions at the first intermediate period when the old kingdom of Egypt collapsed. Uh, and in it, the author is complaining that society is falling apart. The doorkeepers, the servants are saying, "Let's go and plunder." The washerman refuses to carry his load. People are getting out of their place in society. They're getting uppity. A man regards his son as his enemy. The virtuous man goes in mourning. The tribes of the desert have become Egyptians everywhere. All these gall darn foreigners coming in taking over. Sounds like a chimpanzee. Um, Man goes to plow with his shield. Now, you wouldn't normally carry weapons when you're going to plow the field, right? Things are bad. Things are so bad that the women are barren, none conceive. Poor men have become owners of wealth, and he who could not make sandals for himself is now a possessor of riches. The lower classes are are rising up. The class structure is breaking down. Death is not lacking. Blood is everywhere. Noblemen are in distress, and the poor man is full of joy. Every town says, let's suppress the powerful among us. Society is breaking down. I really like near the end about line 33. Crocodiles are glutted with the fish they have taken, for men go to them of their own accord. Things are so bad that people are throwing themselves to the crocodiles. This is what happens when Ma'at is not observed. Society falls apart. The right order of society with all of the social classes in their proper place. Everybody having the status they're supposed to have. The rich being rich and the poor being poor. The upper classes being on top and the lower classes at the bottom. When Ma'at is observed, everybody's in their place. Everybody knows their place. Everybody's in their place. Everybody does what they're supposed to do. It all works out, at least from the author's perspective. When Ma'at is not observed, the world goes to hell in a handbasket. Society breaks down. The social structure breaks down. Families break down. Egypt is no longer dominant over its neighbors. It's the Pharaoh's job, especially, to maintain this order of Ma'at. To see that society is running properly. To see that Egypt has its rightful place dominant over its neighbors. To see that the worship of the gods is carried out in the way that it's supposed to be carried out. Okay. And if that's not done, the world may quite literally fall apart. The sun may not rise tomorrow. The crops may not grow. The Nile may not flood. Society breaks down. The foreigners invade and take over. It's all about maintaining Ma'at.